Galactic University was one of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the known universe. Within its towering spires of shimmering crystal and metal, students from every corner of the galaxy gathered to study the mysteries of biology, physics, and interspecies psychology. The university prided itself on fostering understanding between species, yet certain assumptions about different races persisted, even among its brightest minds. One such assumption was that humans were among the weakest and most fragile beings in the cosmos. Inside the vast domed classroom of Professor Exelvorn, a lesson on pain tolerance had begun. The room, a sleek expanse of polished black stone and glowing holographic displays, was filled with students of various species, each occupying their designated spaces according to their physiological needs. The Zyran, reptilian in nature, preferred the elevated platforms where they could coil their long bodies. The V-Rix, gelatinous beings with shifting forms, floated inside specialized gravity-modulated containment fields. The Rillian, a species of bird-like humanoids, perched on narrow beams, their clawed feet gripping the metal as their keen eyes observed the unfolding experiment below. At the center of the room stood Lieutenant Carter, a human officer from Earth's diplomatic corps. He had been selected for this demonstration due to his extensive experience in xenobiology and his willingness to participate in scientific studies regarding human physiology. Clad in a simple gray uniform, he stood relaxed, his arms crossed over his chest as he listened to the professor's explanation. "Pain is a universal deterrent," Professor Exelvorn said, his deep, resonant voice echoing through the chamber. "Across the galaxy, species have evolved to avoid injury. Some retreat at the first sign of harm, others develop natural defenses, and a few rely on rapid regeneration to survive. But among all recorded species, humans are an anomaly. They lack the armored hides of the Zyran, the regenerative properties of the Rix, or the heightened pain thresholds of the Rillian. And yet, despite these shortcomings, they endure." There was a murmur of disagreement among the students. A Zyran named Varn hissed, his scaled tail flicking against the platform. "Professor, I have studied human biology extensively. Their nervous system is sensitive. They feel pain acutely. They cannot possibly have a high tolerance." The professor raised a clawed hand, silencing the debate before it could escalate. "Which is why, today, we will observe firsthand how a human reacts to injury." He turned to Carter. "Are you prepared, Lieutenant?" Carter nodded. "Go ahead." A robotic assistant hovered forward, its sleek mechanical arms holding a sterilized blade. It moved with precision, extending the blade toward Carter's forearm. The alien students leaned forward, anticipation evident in their wide eyes and twitching appendages. The blade made contact, slicing a clean but deep cut across his skin. A thin line of crimson appeared almost instantly, the blood welling at the surface before beginning a slow descent down his arm. A few gasps echoed through the room. Some students recoiled as though the injury had been inflicted upon them instead. Carter, however, remained perfectly still. He exhaled slowly, glanced down at the wound, and then looked up at the professor as if waiting for further instructions. The silence in the room deepened. The Vrix student, Eula, whose species relied on rapid coagulation to prevent fluid loss, vibrated nervously in her containment field. He does not react," she whispered, her gelatinous body shifting colors in distress. "Does he not feel it?" Carter heard her and smirked. "Oh, I feel it," he said casually, rolling his shoulder. "It's a cut, nothing serious." The disbelief in the room was palpable. The Rylian student, Corvan, clicked his beak in frustration. "Then why do you not cry out? Why do you not seek immediate aid?" Carter shrugged. "Because it's not necessary. Pain is just information. It tells me something is wrong, but it doesn't control me." Varn, still unconvinced, narrowed his reptilian eyes. "But your body is fragile. The blood loss alone should cause distress. If one of my kind were injured in such a manner, the instinct to retreat would be overwhelming." Carter chuckled. "Yeah, but I'm not one of your kind." The professor watched his students closely, gauging their reactions. "Lieutenant Carter's response is what sets humans apart," he said. "Their ability to compartmentalize pain, to control their reaction, is unique. While most species react reflexively, humans have trained themselves, through biology, culture, and experience, to push past their limitations." Eula shuddered. But how far can they push? How much can they endure before they break? Carter lifted his injured arm, the cut still fresh, and flexed his fingers. "You'd be surprised." The moment Carter remained standing without the expected reaction, the atmosphere in the room changed. The students had entered this lesson with certainty that the human would react as any logical being should. Yet before them stood an individual whose actions defied their expectations. Corvin, the Rulian, adjusted his perch, his talons gripping the metal tighter. His species, though formidable in the air, were among the most pain-sensitive in the galaxy. Even minor injuries were treated with immediate medical intervention to prevent distress-induced system failures. The thought of experiencing an open wound without reaction unsettled him. He leaned forward, his golden eyes narrowing as he studied Carter's expression, searching for any subtle sign of suppressed agony. Eula, still trembling in her containment field, tried to process what she had witnessed. Her kind possessed no bones, only a soft, malleable form that allowed for rapid regeneration. Pain was rare, almost non-existent. The concept of enduring a wound that did not immediately seal itself was alien to her in the most literal sense. She vibrated slightly, attempting to steady herself. "Your circulatory fluid continues to escape," she murmured, her voice laced with uncertainty. "How long can your body sustain such a loss before function is impaired?" Carter glanced down at the thin rivulets of red trickling toward his wrist. He wiped a bit of blood away with his thumb, then pressed his fingers against the wound, applying firm pressure. "This? I'd have to lose a lot more before it really became a problem." Varn, the Ziran, coiled his muscular tail, his expression unreadable. His species valued strength above all else, but their endurance was tied to their natural armor. Without it, they were vulnerable. The idea that a creature so physically soft could withstand injury without showing signs of immediate distress challenged his understanding of dominance. Is this a trait of all humans? His tone held skepticism, but beneath it lay an unspoken question. Was this a strength he had underestimated? Carter tilted his head slightly. "Some handle pain better than others. It depends on experience, training. I've seen worse than this, a lot worse." The students exchanged glances. His words implied a history of suffering, something few in the room could relate to. In most advanced civilizations, physical injury was rare, often avoided entirely through medical advancements or evolutionary adaptations. Yet, here stood a man who spoke of worse wounds as if they were mere inconveniences. Professor Exelva observed his students with quiet satisfaction. He had anticipated their reactions, but watching them struggle to reconcile their beliefs with reality was a necessary part of their education. He gestured toward Carter. "Humans possess a unique relationship with pain. Unlike most species, they do not solely view it as a signal for immediate retreat. Instead, they categorize it, adapt to it, and in some cases even ignore it when circumstances demand." Corvan clicked his beak, his wings twitching slightly. "Ignore it? That is inefficient. Pain exists to warn of damage. Why suppress that instinct?" Carter smirked. "Because sometimes stopping isn't an option." Silence stretched between them. The implication was clear. Humans did not avoid pain because they lacked the ability to feel it, but because they had learned to push past it. Eula hesitated before speaking again, her gelatinous body shifting in translucent waves. "You imply necessity, yet necessity breeds evolution. Would it not be advantageous for your kind to develop a means to prevent pain entirely rather than endure it?" Carter exhaled through his nose, considering her words. "You'd think so, but our survival depends on endurance. We weren't born with natural armor. rapid regeneration, or any of the advantages most of you have. So we had to learn how to keep going despite pain. He lifted his arm slightly, blood still seeping from the wound. We adapt. We push through. That's how we survive. Varn studied him carefully, his sharp eyes flicking between Carter's face and the injury. So, pain is not a deterrent for your kind. Carter shook his head. It is, but it's not a limit. The realization settled over the students in different ways. Corvan, raised in a society where even the smallest injury was treated with utmost urgency, struggled to comprehend such an approach. Eula, whose species barely understood pain at all, was disturbed by the very notion of enduring it willingly. Varn, however, seemed almost intrigued, as if he had glimpsed an aspect of humanity he had never considered before. Professor X. Vorn let the moment hang before he stepped forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the room. You have all learned something today. Your assumptions about humanity were incomplete. Pain tolerance is not merely a biological trait, but a psychological adaptation. This lesson is far from over. His words carried weight, but Carter could see it in the students' eyes. They were no longer merely studying him. They were reevaluating everything they thought they knew. The silence in the room lingered longer than before. The students, each from species with vastly different biological and psychological reactions to pain, were struggling to reconcile what they had just learned. Carter remained standing at the center, seemingly unbothered by the wound on his arm. His casual demeanor only deepened the unease among those watching. Varn, the Xiran, finally moved, his long tail uncoiling as he leaned forward, eyes locked onto the human's arm. His people valued physical dominance, yet their strength relied on armor-like scales protecting their bodies from harm. The idea of being exposed to injury without any natural defense unsettled him. He had always assumed that humans were fragile, but now he saw that their true strength lay elsewhere. You claim pain is not a limit, he said slowly, as if tasting the words. Yet without limits, how does your kind know when to stop? Carter wiped away another trickle of blood before responding. We don't always stop when we should. Sometimes, that's what gets us killed. But sometimes, pushing past the pain is the only way to survive. Corvan shifted on his perch, his golden eyes sharp with skepticism. That is illogical. If pain exists as a warning, ignoring it would only increase risk. Carter smirked, tilting his head slightly. Sometimes risk is necessary. If you were trapped, injured, and your only chance at survival was pushing forward despite the pain, would you stop? Corvan's feathers ruffled slightly. He understood the hypothetical scenario, but his instincts recoiled from the idea. His kind relied on speed and precision. If one of them was injured, continuing to fight or flee was usually impossible. He opened his beak to respond, but the professor cut in before he could. This is precisely why humans are unique among sentient species, Professor Exelvorn said. Most beings adhere strictly to the biological limitations imposed upon them. Humans, however, override those limitations through sheer willpower. Eula, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly rippled within her containment field. Willpower cannot alter biology, she murmured, her voice uncertain. Pain and injury still lead to system failure. Your species is not immune to death. Carter's smile faded slightly. No, we're not. But our ability to endure is what keeps us alive long enough to win. The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, sent a ripple of unease through the group. The implication was clear. Humans had survived precisely because they had learned to suffer and keep going. The concept was deeply unsettling to those who had evolved under completely different conditions. Varn exhaled sharply, his reptilian features unreadable. And what of fear? Surely you still fear pain, even if you can endure it? Carter's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered the question. Fear's a different thing. We feel it, but it doesn't always mean we stop. He glanced at his arm. I've been in situations where fear could have kept me alive, but I've also been in situations where it would have gotten me killed. So you learn to push it aside when you have to." The students absorbed his words in silence. Each of them, in their own way, had relied on fear to survive. It was a universal instinct, something ingrained into all living creatures. Yet here was a being who claimed to ignore it when necessary. Yula pulsed slightly, her translucent form flickering. "That is unnatural," she whispered. "It goes against every survival instinct I understand." Carter exhaled, rubbing his forearm absently. Maybe. But it's what's kept us alive when we should have been wiped out." Professor X. Vorn stepped forward again, his massive form casting long shadows across the room. "This lesson is not simply about pain tolerance," he said. "It is about understanding why humans have defied expectations throughout history, why they have survived encounters with far stronger species, why they continue to push beyond what should be possible." Varn studied Carter for a long moment before speaking again. "I assumed humans were weak," he admitted. "Now I see that I misunderstood what strength truly is." Carter glanced at him, then at the others, noting their changed expressions. The initial disbelief had faded, replaced by something else, something closer to understanding, maybe even respect. He exhaled softly, shaking his head. "Strength isn't just about what you're made of. It's about what you're willing to endure." And with that, the lesson took on a meaning none of them would ever forget. A heavy silence settled over the classroom as the weight of Carter's words sank into the students' minds. The discussion had shifted from detached scientific curiosity to something deeper, something that made them question the very nature of strength and survival. The initial shock of his endurance had given way to fascination, and now an unspoken challenge lingered in the air. Professor Exalvorn, ever observant, noted the way the students regarded Carter now. Before, they had viewed him as an anomaly, a subject for academic study. Now there was a flicker of something else. Acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. He turned his gaze toward Varn, the Zyran, who had been among the most skeptical. "You seem troubled," the professor said, his voice calm but probing. "What have you realized?" Varn's tail twitched against the platform as he exhaled sharply, his slitted eyes locked onto Carter. "I believed endurance was a function of biology. My kind rely on natural defenses, armor, strength, speed. We do not persist through pain. We avoid it. But this is different." His gaze drifted down to Carter's arm, where the wound remained open but no longer seemed to concern him. "You do not ignore injury. You do not fail to recognize its danger. And yet, you continue. I have never encountered a species that behaves in such a way." Carter rolled his shoulders slightly, his body still relaxed despite the scrutiny. "It's not just me. Most humans learn to push through discomfort, some more than others." He let a brief smirk cross his face. "You should see how we train our soldiers." Corvan's feathers ruffled, his talons tightening against his perch. The thought of systematic endurance training unsettled him. His species did not subject themselves to unnecessary suffering. Even minor injuries were treated with immediate precision, ensuring minimal distress. "Your kind chooses pain?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of incredulity and disapproval. "You place yourselves in situations where injury is inevitable?" Carter gave a slow nod. "Training for pain helps us handle it when it's real. If you know what to expect, it's easier to control your response. It stops you from panicking, keeps you alive when it matters." The room seemed to shrink as the students processed his words. Eula, who had remained unusually quiet, suddenly pulsed within her containment field, her translucent form shifting erratically. "Control," she whispered. "You claim to control something that should control you." Her species did not experience pain in the same way others did, but the concept of overriding a core survival instinct disturbed her deeply. "Is this natural for your kind?" Carter exhaled, running a hand over his injured arm as if considering how best to explain it. "I wouldn't say it's natural, but it's necessary. The universe isn't kind. If you can't handle suffering, you don't last long. Varn let out a low hiss, his tail coiling again as his mind worked through the implications. Then your strength is not in your body, he mused. It is in your mind. Carter's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. Now you're getting it. Professor X.L. Vorn took a step forward, his massive form moving with careful deliberation. You have all learned something invaluable today, he said, addressing his students. Human resilience is not merely a physical trait. It is a philosophy, a way of life. His gaze swept across the room. This lesson was never just about pain tolerance. It was about understanding what makes a species endure, why some civilizations survive while others fade. Eula trembled slightly, her shifting form pulsating in a slow, uneven rhythm. And humans have survived because they have mastered suffering. Carter let the words hang between them before giving a slow nod. That's one way to put it. The room remained silent for several long moments. The lesson had reached beyond academic curiosity and touched something deeper, something that made each student reflect on their own limitations. Varn's once dismissive skepticism had turned to careful consideration. Corvin's rigid beliefs about logic and efficiency now felt insufficient. Even Eula, whose kind had never known true pain, was beginning to see that the rules of survival were not as absolute as she had once believed. Professor Exalvorn clasped his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. I suspect this will not be a lesson any of you soon forget, he said. But for now, we will end here. Carter relaxed his posture slightly, though he could still feel the weight of their gazes on him. He had walked into this room as a subject of study, but he knew he was leaving it as something else entirely, a challenge to everything these students had thought they understood. The students remained in their seats long after Professor Exalin dismissed the lesson. Normally, they would have dispersed quickly, eager to discuss the day's findings among their own kind. But this time, there was no immediate chatter, no debates filled with the confident assumptions of superior knowledge. There was only quiet reflection, and the occasional, uncertain glance toward Carter, who was still standing at the center of the room, idly flexing his injured arm. Varn was the first to break the silence, his reptilian tail flicking against the metal surface of his platform. His golden eyes studied Carter with an intensity that had shifted from skepticism to something else. Curiosity mixed with the reluctant acknowledgement of respect. I misjudged your kind, he admitted, his voice lower than before. I assumed strength came only from the body. But it is clear now that the mind is a weapon of its own. Carter gave a slight shrug, his expression unreadable. Pain is temporary. The only thing that really matters is whether you let it stop you. Corvin shifted on his perch, his feathers ruffling slightly as he spoke. But where is the limit? If your kind ignores suffering, when do you recognize that you have pushed too far? His talons clicked against the beam as he considered his own question. Or do you simply refuse to acknowledge the consequences? Carter exhaled slowly, considering his words. Of course we recognize limits. We just don't let fear decide where those limits are. There's a difference between understanding risk and giving up just because something hurts. His gaze moved over the students. Pain is part of life. The real question is whether you let it define you. Eula pulsed softly within her containment field, her form shifting with slow, uncertain waves. She had been the most visibly disturbed by the lesson, struggling to comprehend the nature of pain and endurance in a way that had never been necessary for her species. But why? She asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Why endure suffering if it can be avoided? Carter tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. Because sometimes you don't have a choice. Because sometimes the only way forward is through it. He lifted his injured arm slightly. This is just a cut. It'll heal. But what happens when it's not just a wound? What happens when it's something bigger? Something that threatens everything you care about? His voice took on a weight that hadn't been there before. You either fight through it or you don't make it. Varn narrowed his eyes. And that is why your kind survives? He let the words hang between them before he spoke again. That is why others underestimate you, until it is too late. Carter met his gaze but said nothing. He didn't need to. The realization had already settled over the room. Professor Exalvorn finally stepped forward, his massive presence once again drawing the attention of the students. Today you have all witnessed something beyond mere physiology. This was never simply about the ability to withstand pain. His gaze swept across the room. This was about understanding the nature of resilience, of determination, of the will to continue even in the face of suffering. Eula's translucent form rippled. And that is what makes humans different, the professor nodded. It is what makes them dangerous. Not their strength, not their speed, not their numbers, but their refusal to break. Corvin's feathers settled as he processed the words. And that is why they survive battles they should lose. Professor Exaldorn's expression remained unreadable. It is why they win wars. A long silence followed. The weight of the lesson pressed upon the students in ways no textbook ever could. They had entered this room believing they understood humanity, believing that, for all their adaptability, humans were still bound by the same limitations as every other species. Now, they saw the truth. Varn's tail curled around his platform as he exhaled slowly. I see now why you do not fear injury, Carter. It is not because you do not feel it. It is because you refuse to let it control you. Carter let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, don't get me wrong, I don't like pain, but fear won't stop me from doing what needs to be done. He glanced toward the professor. And that's the real lesson, isn't it? Professor Exvorn inclined his head. Yes, and you have taught it well. With that, the lesson was truly over. The students slowly began to gather their things, but none of them rushed to leave. Even as they stepped away, their thoughts remained tethered to what they had witnessed. Carter watched them go, knowing that today's discussion would ripple far beyond this classroom. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered what these students would do with this knowledge. Would it change how they viewed humans? Would it change how they approached their own limitations? He had a feeling it would, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real victory here.